It was supposed to be a simple drive home. A shortcut, I thought, a faster way to get back after the Halloween party. I wasn't even supposed to be on that road, but there it was, dark and winding, beckoning me like a forgotten path. The GPS had rerouted me down this old, desolate stretch of pavement, and against my better judgment, I followed. The headlights cut through the thick fog that clung to the road like a living thing. Tall, skeletal trees lined the sides, their branches gnarled and twisted, reaching out as if they might tear the car from the ground at any moment. The moon was hidden behind clouds, leaving only the faint glow of my headlights to guide me. The road was empty. Too empty. As I drove further, the uneasy silence inside the car grew heavier, pressing against my chest. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. It wasn't until I saw the first figure that my heart began to race. A woman stood by the side of the road, her dress tattered and soaked. She didn't wave for help, didn't scream, she just stood there staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. I blinked, and she was gone. My pulse quickened. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear creeping up my spine. "I'm seeing things," I muttered under my breath, but I couldn't convince myself. Something felt wrong. The road, the fog, that woman, they didn't belong here. Or maybe I didn't. The car began to sputter. First, the radio hissed with static, even though I hadn't touched it. Then the dashboard lights flickered erratically. The engine coughed, a deep, unhealthy sound that made my stomach lurch. I glanced at the fuel gauge. It was full. The car shouldn't be dying. But it was. I pulled over to the side of the road. The moment the engine cut off, everything around me felt wrong. The air was heavy, thick with an unseen presence. I sat in the driver's seat, the fog pressing against the windows, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I didn't want to get out, but I had no choice. The car wasn't going to start itself. I stepped out into the cold, damp air, the mist swirling around me as if it had a life of its own. I popped the hood, but before I could even glance at the engine, something moved in the corner of my vision. A shadow darting across the road, too quick to be human. My heart pounded in my chest. I spun around, my eyes scanning the fog, but nothing was there. Just the empty road stretching out into the unknown. My breath caught in my throat when I heard it. A low whisper, faint and distant, as if it were carried on the wind. It was a voice, but I couldn't make out the words. Then I saw the headlights. Far off down the road, a pair of headlights appeared, growing brighter, faster, coming toward me. Relief washed over me. Someone else was here. I waved, trying to get their attention, but the car didn't slow down. Instead, it barreled toward me at an alarming speed, the engine roaring louder and louder until it was a deafening growl in the night. I jumped out of the way just in time. The car flew past me, disappearing into the fog without a sound. No squeal of tires, no crash, nothing. It just vanished into the mist, leaving me standing there, my heart thudding in my ears. The whispering returned, louder now, closer. I could feel it crawling under my skin, wrapping around me like icy fingers. I backed away, trying to get back into the car, but then I saw it. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure. A man, his face twisted in agony, blood dripping from his hands and pooling at his feet. His eyes locked onto mine, and I couldn't move. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. Behind him, more figures appeared, ghostly apparitions, their bodies mangled and broken, their eyes full of despair. They began to surround me, closing in with each step. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I felt the world spinning around me. Suddenly, I was no longer on the side of the road. I was in the middle of a scene, a wreck. Twisted metal, shattered glass, blood everywhere. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber and gasoline. My head pounded as I tried to understand what was happening. I heard the screech of tires, felt the impact before I saw it. A car slammed into mine, flipping it over and over. Screams filled the air, but they weren't mine. They were theirs. The ghosts, trapped in an endless loop, reliving the crash that had claimed their lives decades ago. And now they wanted me to join them. The last thing I saw was the man's face, his blood-stained hands reaching for me, pulling me into the wreckage. I woke up to the sound of my own breathing, harsh and ragged, echoing inside the car. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, but I wasn't driving anymore. I was just sitting there, the engine silent, the fog still swirling outside. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But when I looked down at my trembling hands, I saw it. Blood. It wasn't mine. The dark crimson stains smeared across my fingers, dripping onto the dashboard. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked around, frantically trying to make sense of what had just happened. The road was empty again, but the smell of burning rubber still lingered in the air. My car was upright, untouched, but my surroundings felt off. There was something wrong with the fog. It wasn't just mist anymore. It was thicker, darker, almost alive, as if it was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. The whispers were back, but this time they were clearer, more distinct. Voices overlapping, murmuring, getting closer. I strained to hear, my heart pounding in my chest. "Help us! You have to take our place!" I recoiled, my stomach flipping. The blood on my hands felt heavier now, as though it belonged to someone else. I wiped it on my pants, but it wouldn't come off. I could still feel it, sticky and cold, clinging to my skin like a curse. I had to get out of here. I fumbled for the keys, trying to start the engine, but the car was dead. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, frustration bubbling up in my throat. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, threatening to take over, but I forced myself to breathe. "Think," I whispered to myself, "just think." Then I saw it. In the distance, through the thickening fog, the faint outline of something, a sign, maybe, or a house. I couldn't be sure, but it was the only thing that stood out in this suffocating void of mist and darkness. I got out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. The moment my feet touched the ground, the whispers grew louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder, but the road behind me was as empty as ever. No more figures, no more headlights. Just me alone. I took a few hesitant steps toward the shape in the distance, but every part of me screamed to get back in the car. To lock the doors, to stay put. But I couldn't. I needed to know what was out there. The closer I got, the more the fog seemed to part, revealing something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a sign. It wasn't a house. It was a car. An old, rusted-out wreck, half buried in the ditch by the side of the road. Its windows were shattered, the metal twisted and burned as if it had been in an accident decades ago. My heart sank when I realized it was the same car that had nearly hit me earlier, the one that had disappeared into the fog. My head spun. How could this be possible? As I approached, the whispering stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against my skull, making it hard to think. I peered inside the wreckage, but there was no one there. Just the remnants of what looked like old, rotting leather seats and a broken steering wheel. But then I saw something glinting in the darkness. Something small and metallic lying on the passenger seat. A locket. I reached in, my hand trembling as I picked it up. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal, the fog seemed to close in around me. My breath hitched as a sharp, piercing sound filled the air. A woman's scream, loud and shrill, like she was right next to me. I stumbled backward, dropping the locket. But the screaming didn't stop. It was coming from the road. I turned, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Through the fog, I could see them again, the figures. This time there were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, standing in the middle of the road, their eyes fixed on me. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their bodies broken and twisted in ways that made me want to vomit. Blood dripped from their wounds, pooling onto the pavement, but they didn't move. Then one of them stepped forward. The man. The same man I'd seen before, with his blood-stained hands and empty eyes. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, and yet I could hear him in my head. "You have to take our place." I shook my head, backing away, my legs trembling beneath me. "No," I whispered. "I didn't do this. I didn't." The ground beneath me shifted, and suddenly I wasn't standing on the road anymore. I was standing in the middle of the crash. The wrecked cars, the blood, the bodies. It was all around me, a living nightmare that I couldn't escape. I could smell the burning flesh, feel the heat of the flames licking at my skin. The screams filled my ears, drowning out everything else. Then, the man was in front of me again, his bloodied hands reaching out, pulling me closer, his voice rasping in my ear. "It's your turn now." I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. I bolted upright, gasping for air. The world around me spun, and for a moment I didn't know where I was. My vision was blurry, my heart racing, but then reality crashed in. I was still on the road, standing by the wreckage of that old car, the fog swirling around me like a thick blanket of dread. But something was wrong. The figures, the voices, they were gone. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than the screams had been. My body felt heavy, like I was being pulled down into the earth. I wiped at my face, half expecting to find blood, but my hands were clean now. No more crimson stains. The locket. I looked down at it, still lying in the dirt where I had dropped it. A strange compulsion urged me to pick it up again, but I didn't dare. It wasn't just some old piece of jewelry, it was a tether, an anchor to whatever dark forces haunted this road. I needed to leave it. I needed to leave Asterisk, now Asterisk. I turned back toward my car, but the moment I did, my stomach sank. The car wasn't there. It had vanished. Panic surged through me. I spun in place, searching through the dense fog, but it was like the road had swallowed it whole. My breath came in shallow gasps as my mind raced. I was stranded, miles away from anything familiar, trapped on a road that didn't want me to leave. That's when I heard it, the low growl of an engine in the distance. My pulse quickened. It was coming from up the road, the same direction I had seen that ghostly car earlier. A chill crawled up my spine as the sound grew louder. This time it wasn't just a phantom. This was real, but something about it felt wrong. The headlights pierced through the fog, blinding me as the vehicle approached. My instinct screamed for me to run, to get as far away as possible, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, a deer caught in the oncoming headlights. The car screeched to a stop just inches from me. I stumbled backward, barely managing to stay on my feet as the door swung open. A figure stepped out, shrouded in the darkness. At first, I couldn't make out their face, but as they stepped into the dim glow of the headlights, a wave of recognition washed over me. Dot. It was the man. Dot. The same man from before. The one with the blood-stained hands and the hollow eyes. But this time, he wasn't a ghost. He was real, standing right in front of me, his gaze cold and unyielding. My stomach twisted in knots as I realized what was happening. This wasn't just a haunting. I was part of it now. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and gravelly like he hadn't spoken in years. He took a step closer, and I could see the blood dripping from his fingers again, pooling on the ground. "You shouldn't have taken their place." "I didn't take anyone's place," I shouted, backing away from him. "I don't even know what's happening." His expression didn't change. He just stared at me, unblinking, as if my words didn't matter. "You took the locket! That was enough!" I shook my head violently. "No, I didn't mean to. It doesn't matter." He took another step forward, his eyes locked on mine. "The road takes what it wants, and now it wants you." I opened my mouth to scream, but before any sound could escape, I felt something cold and sharp wrap around my ankle. I looked down in horror to see a thin, pale hand emerging from the ground, its bony fingers digging into my skin. I tried to pull away, but the hand held fast, its grip tightening with each passing second. More hands began to emerge from the ground, clawing at my legs, my arms, pulling me down into the earth. I thrashed and kicked, but it was no use. The more I struggled, the deeper they dragged me. Dot. The man watched in silence, his face emotionless as I sank into the cold, wet ground. My body was being swallowed whole, just like my car, just like everyone else who had come before me. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent now, filling my head with a cacophony of voices that made it impossible to think. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the darkness. The hands continued to pull me under, their icy touch suffocating me. I was drowning in dirt and blood, the weight of the dead crushing me from all sides. Just when I thought it was over, everything stopped. The hands released me. The fog cleared. I gasped for air, scrambling to my feet, but when I looked around, I realized I was no longer standing on the road. I was standing in the middle of the wreck. Cars were strewn across the pavement, twisted metal and shattered glass littering the ground. The stench of gasoline and burnt rubber filled the air, along with something far worse, the metallic tang of blood. Bodies lay everywhere, their faces twisted in agony, their limbs contorted in unnatural ways. It was like stepping into a nightmare. And then I saw them, the figures from before. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were real, their bodies broken and bloodied, just like mine would be. They stared at me with lifeless eyes, their mouths moving silently as if they were trying to tell me something. That's when I realized the truth. I wasn't a visitor here. I was one of them. The man appeared beside me, his face twisted into a cruel smile. "Welcome," he said, his voice a whisper in the wind. "Now it's your turn." And as the world around me began to fade, the last thing I saw was my own reflection in the shattered glass of the wreckage, my face twisted in the same expression of terror that I had seen on all of theirs. The darkness wrapped around me like a shroud, cold and suffocating. I struggled to breathe, my chest tight with panic as the weight of the world pressed down on me. The blood, the wreckage, the ghosts, all of it swirled in my mind, blending into a nightmare I couldn't escape. But then something changed. In the distance, through the thick fog and broken bodies, I saw a light. At first, it was faint, just a pinprick in the sea of darkness, but it grew brighter and brighter, cutting through the shadows. I blinked, unsure if it was real or just another cruel trick of the road. But the warmth that came with it was undeniable. The fog began to lift, peeling away like layers of an old, rotting curtain. The cold hands that had been pulling me under loosened their grip, and I could feel my body rising, being freed from the earth's icy hold. The air grew warmer, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope flicker in my chest. I took a step toward the light, then another. The whispers faded, replaced by a sound I hadn't heard in what felt like an eternity: birds. The sweet, soft chirping of birds filled the air, and with it the scent of fresh rain on grass. My heart pounded, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of hope. I reached the edge of the light, and as I stepped into it, the scene around me transformed. The wreckage, the bodies, the blood, it all disappeared, replaced by a road bathed in the soft glow of morning. The fog that had once suffocated me was gone, leaving behind clear skies streaked with the first rays of dawn. I was back on the road, but it wasn't the same. It was peaceful now. No more ghosts, no more terror, just the sound of nature waking up to a new day. I turned to look behind me, half expecting to see the wreckage still lurking in the shadows, but it was gone. The haunted road, the twisted figures, all of it had vanished, as if it had never existed in the first place. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. The woman I had first seen on the side of the road. The one whose eyes had been empty and hollow. But now she wasn't a ghost. She was standing at the edge of the road, bathed in the same warm light, her dress clean and her face peaceful. She smiled at me, a real, genuine smile, and nodded as if to say, "You're free now." Asterisk. I blinked, unsure of what to say, but before I could speak, she turned and walked into the light, disappearing into the sunrise. I stood there for a moment, stunned, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Had it all been real? The ghosts, the car crash, the terror that had gripped me so tightly. Or had it been some kind of twisted vision, a test that I had somehow passed? I didn't know, but I did know one thing: I was alive, and I was free. I walked back to my car, my steps light and unburdened. To my surprise, it was sitting there, just as I had left it, gleaming in the soft morning light. I climbed in, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. The engine roared to life with a reassuring purr, and I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. As I drove down the road, leaving the haunted stretch of pavement behind me, I felt something shift inside. The terror, the darkness, it was all behind me now. The road ahead was clear, open, full of possibility, and as I drove away, I couldn't help but smile. Whatever haunted that road, whatever curse had claimed so many before me, had let me go. I had been given a second chance, and this time I wasn't going to waste it. The sun rose higher in the sky, and with it, my hope. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive.